the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Tuesday, March 24th, 2015. Mexico's farm workers protest poor working conditions harvesting produce for the U.S. We'll speak with labor journalist David Bacon. And why was a hearing-impaired homeless man imprisoned by a Virginia sheriff for 6 weeks and denied access to an interpreter? We'll hear from his attorney, Caroline Jackson. Plus, poet Amy Uyematsu joins us to discuss her new book of poetry, The Yellow Door. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Israeli officials this morning are denying that their government spied on the U.S. in order to thwart a nuclear deal with Iran. The Israeli Minister for Intelligence and Strategic Affairs, Yuval Steinitz, said, quote, Israel does not spy on the United States, period, exclamation mark. He added, whoever published those false allegations possibly wanted to damage the excellent intelligence cooperation between us and the United States, end of quote. The allegations he referred to were published yesterday in the Wall Street Journal. The journal claimed that Israeli officials obtained sensitive information from U.S. officials, European diplomatic contacts, and informants, and then fed that information back to members of the U.S. Congress. The story threatens to widen the rift between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Barack Obama. Well, Bob, of course, the U.S. spies on everyone, and it shouldn't surprise us that Israel might do the same to us. The real surprise seems to be the very public arena in which this U.S.-Israeli rift is playing out. Do you agree?
Yes, it's well known that these two countries are spying on each other. All you have to do is recall Jonathan Pollard, who was imprisoned in 1987 for this, spying on the United States or sending secrets to Israel on the United States. What was interesting about that was that it was a departure from the usual quid pro quo where everybody knows this is going on. But what's really important, as you point out, is that Israel has long wanted to pressure members of Congress to affect administration policy, but now Israel is going directly to Congress to try and upend administration policy. That's the departure from the normal procedure, and that's what's so important. And not surprisingly, the Obama administration, which has been typically slavishly devoted to Israel, like most administrations, it's pushing the Obama administration to finally say enough.
Well, it's official. Years after it abandoned death by firing squad, the state of Utah will once more rely on that gruesome method of execution as a backup. Governor Gary Herbert signed a measure into law yesterday making official the option of death by firing squad in cases where lethal injections are not available. The move is an internationally embarrassing symbol of the U.S.'s continued reliance on capital punishment. European drug manufacturers have been refusing to sell the ingredients for injections to U.S. states based on their objections to the practice. There are currently no reserves of lethal drug cocktails in Utah. A convict named Ronnie Lee Gardner was the last to be executed by a firing squad in 2010, but because of public outrage, Utah officially ended the practice then. Well, Bob, the Washington Post had a report this morning saying that a firing squad might not be such a bad idea, given that it takes just minutes to die, while a lethal injection can make a person suffer for a lot longer. How do you respond to this level of discourse in our media about this, whole idea of capital punishment?
Well, before we get to that, I was thinking of dropping by the studio later, Sonali, and I was planning to beat you. And I don't know if should I bring a lead pipe or a stainless steel rod. I haven't decided which. I'd like your input on that. Of course, the obvious response is it doesn't matter what I'm going to beat you with. I shouldn't be beating you. And this is the same response I would have to the capital punishment. There is a point, if you look at the data, that the firing squad is actually a more reliable way to end someone's life relatively painlessly. But the whole point is that capital punishment is barbaric, that capital punishment gives the state a power that no state should have, the right to end a life. And the fact that we're still talking about this in the United States is, as you point out, a kind of painful reminder of how the United States, which we would hope would be setting the standard for certain kinds of legal and moral principles, often finds itself living in the 18th century.
And finally, Afghanistan's new president, during his first trip to the United States since his inauguration, is planning on officially asking the U.S. to extend its occupation of his country. Mr. Ashraf Ghani will meet with President Obama and Vice President Joe Biden this morning and will apparently be requesting that the U.S. retain 10,000 troops past a deadline for withdrawal. According to the New York Times, administration officials have strongly suggested that Mr. Obama would agree to slow the pace of the troop withdrawal. Mr. Ghani was strongly backed by the U.S. during the election and was even touted as a progressive alternative to warlord candidates. One of his first acts in office, he signed a U.S. Afghanistan Status of Forces agreement that his predecessor, Hamid Karzai, had refused to sign. Last year was the worst year for casualties in Afghanistan since 2009, with a total of 10,000 deaths. Well, Bob, we shouldn't be surprised by this turn of events, should we, as the U.S.-backed president is asking the U.S. to stay on in his country?
Well, I hate to go back in time, but reading this story, it's hard not to think about South Vietnam. Remember, there was a time when the United States had troops in South Vietnam, and it was understood that if you were the president of South Vietnam, you accepted that. And it was also a point where it was clear that when U.S. troops left South Vietnam, the government had no legitimacy and was bound to fall to forces. And I think that's what we're looking at. It's not clear that any government in Afghanistan that can survive in the current climate without U.S. troops, but yet any government in Afghanistan that embraces U.S. troops is going to never be legitimate in the eyes of the Afghan people. All of this is just a reminder that the 2001 invasion was a tragic mistake, that the United States in that fervor post 9/11 was not thinking clearly. Even if you're a militarist, this was a bad response. And now we're stuck with the consequences of that. I don't see a way out of it. Obviously, negotiating with the Taliban is the starting point, but it's not clear there's any good solution to this situation.
Bob Jensen, I want to thank you as always for joining us today. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Did you know that Uprising is now a TV show as well as a radio show? We rely on subscribers to our YouTube channel to fund the TV production of Uprising. You can sign up to be a subscriber right now at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. A major strike in San Quentin, Mexico, has halted the shipment of some produce to the United States. An area 200 miles north of San Diego, California, is home to thousands of acres of farmland tilled by mostly indigenous poor farm workers. Tired of their demands for higher wages and better working conditions going unheard, the farmers launched a strike last Tuesday, blocking traffic across a major highway. There have been some reports of attacks against truckers attempting to cross the barricades, and Mexican authorities say they've arrested 200 workers involved. Thousands of tons of produce may be on the verge of rotting in the fields and in containers. My guest is David Bacon. He's an award-winning photojournalist, an author, a labor journalist, and former labor organizer. He's written many books, including The Children of NAFTA, Labor Wars on the U.S.-Mexico Border, and The Right to Stay Home, How U.S. Policy Drives Mexican Migration. Welcome to Uprising, David.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, as far as you know, are the farm workers that are at the heart of the story mostly harvesting produce for U.S. markets? I know that one of the brands is Driscoll, which sells organic and conventional strawberries and raspberries to stores like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's.
And Safeway. In fact, Driscoll's probably the biggest strawberry producer in the United States, and who knows, maybe the world. But yes, they are. All of these ranches in the San Quintin Valley and in Baja California in general are producing for the U.S. market. They don't produce for the Mexican market at all. They've historically, in fact, they were started in an effort to supply the U.S. market, especially with tomatoes and strawberries, at a time when the only place in the United States really that's growing and harvesting them is Florida. So basically, you know, this is what they do. The ranchers, there are about 12 large growers in the San Quintin Valley, And they've been there since this kind of agriculture started in the 1960s. You could sort of think of them as being like the maquiladoras, you know, the factories along the U.S.-Mexico border on the Mexican side that were basically developed and established to take advantage of the low wages of workers in Mexico. And the same thing really happened here with the setting up of what are really agriculture industrial enterprises, kind of like we would see in the Central Valley here in California, that are producing for export.
And in fact, I'm glad you brought that up, because it seems as though the operations between the Central Valley of California, which feeds a huge chunk of the United States in terms of produce, and these operations just across the border in San Quintin are quite similar in the kinds of workers that are employed and the companies involved and the harvest, who the harvest is intended for, except perhaps that across the border there are certain labor and environmental conditions that don't have to be met?
Yes, you're right. The workforce in the San Quintin Valley consists of people who are coming mostly from Oaxaca, from southern Mexico. They're indigenous people who speak primarily Mixteco and Triqui, which are indigenous languages that were hundreds, if not thousands of years old when Columbus first got to the Americas. So these are people coming from very established communities with a very old culture. Baja California and the San Quintin Valley, up until the 1960s, was one of the least populated areas in Mexico. So when they set up these farms there, they had to find a workforce, and because there really were not enough people there locally to be able to sustain agriculture of this kind. And so they began bringing workers up from Oaxaca, housing them in labor camps. One of the biggest complaints of the workers is that the conditions in the labor camps are really awful. They're really terrible. I've been there, I've seen it, and it's true, they are. Because it's been going on for such a long time now, some families have been able to move out of the labor camps and look for housing or build their own housing, which has led to further conflicts because the families have settled on federally owned land in and around the fields there in some of the communities along the main highway. And there have been conflicts with the government over people kind of trying to find land to build housing of their own on. So there are housing fights that are adding to the bitterness of the workers, who are also angry clearly at the wages that they're getting. But as workers came up through Baja California, especially during the 1970s and the 1980s, then people also began crossing over into California, which is the source of the indigenous migration into the Central Valley, and now up to Washington State and really in many agricultural areas in the United States. So these are all connected communities. The strike that's going on in Baja California right now, for instance, is big news in Skagit County in Washington, where the harvest season hasn't started yet, but where the same families and people from the same communities in Oaxaca are living now. In fact, I was just talking to somebody who made a video greeting to the strikers who are coming from the same town that he does, and he's living in near Bellingham in Washington State.
Well, there has been very little media coverage in the English language press, David, of the strike. In fact, as far as I can tell, the LA Times has been the only English language paper really covering this in detail, and even they haven't really updated. So it's not, I'm not aware of whether the strike is still continuing and whether there have been any more arrests. But what do you make of this very poor media coverage of a strike that directly involves food that Americans are relying on?
Well, just to fill in the news piece here for a second, and then talk about the media.
Yeah.
The strikers are negotiating today with the state government in Baja California. This has been one of their principal demands, is that the state government sit down with them and talk, because many of the conditions that they're complaining about are actual violations of Mexican law. And so one of their demands is that the government actually enforce the law, as well as pressure the companies into improving conditions. And of course, people are now demanding that the 200 people who were arrested when they blocked the highway, that the charges against them be dropped as well, too. And blocking the highway, it sounds very dramatic in the United States, but this is sort of a traditional Mexican protest method, especially in rural areas. This is how people get attention to the complaints that they have when the authorities ignore them. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the United States, I think, because the U.S. media doesn't pay a lot of attention to Mexico, period, and it doesn't pay a lot of attention to working class struggles, even in the United States, let alone in Mexico. Right. So, with those two kinds of biases, I have to say, Sonali, I'm not really surprised to see that, we don't have an article in the New York Times or the San Francisco Chronicle or what have you about it. I think that what happens in Baja California, even though, as you're pointing out, we eat the fruit and the vegetables that these workers are producing, the workers themselves are invisible. The indigenous communities tend to be invisible and off the media radar screen. Farm workers, whether in the United States or in Baja California, tend to be invisible. And then labor struggles in Mexico also tend to be invisible. So I think that this is sort of the class bias of the U.S. media at play here.
And David, I understand that there are unions that are representing at least some workers, this is per the LA Times, but workers are asking for the formation of an independent union that is less beholden to the growers?
Well, I'm not actually familiar with, unions for farm workers that are government-affiliated unions. There is a history of labor activity in Baja California. There was a very left-wing union in Baja California that organized strikes in the mid-1980s there. That union sort of disappeared on the national labor scene. And I think one of the reasons why workers are organizing this independent union is because of the lack of organizations that will help them to organize and to represent themselves. So they've organized a union called the Alliance of National, State, and Municipal Organizations for Social Justice. And what I think is also a very important part of it is that they are being supported by one of the most important organizations in the indigenous community in Mexico and the United States, and that is the Binational Front of Indigenous Organizations, or called by its initials FIOB, which has chapters in the U.S. and chapters in Mexico, and they're one of the support bases. And recently, the United Farm Workers had a representative that was also went down to Baja California to visit with the workers and to talk with them about, the kind of support that, unions in the United States, farm worker unions, might be able to offer them. So they are getting some support both from indigenous communities here in the United States and indigenous community organizations, and also I think some labor support is starting to show up as well.
Yeah, and I want to quote the LA Times that said any changes to work conditions in the fields would require a long legal process because contracts already exist between the agribusinesses and the unions that represent laborers. In Mexico, many farm workers are part of large unions that represent employees from many industries, but those union leaders are often seen as tools of business interests. So it certainly remains to be seen how this conflict will play out. How has the Mexican government, as far as you can tell, responded, David? I mean, certainly we've heard of the arrest of 200 workers that were blocking traffic, and now they're, as you said, they're negotiating for those charges to be dropped. But has there been any sense that the government is taking these protests seriously?
Well, I think the state government in Baja California of Governor de la Madrid is a conservative government. It's the National Action Party, which is the kind of right wing of the Mexican political spectrum there. And they have a history of repression in Baja California, not just directed against farm workers, but directed against maquiladora workers when they've tried to set up independent unions. So I think that the first reaction of the state government was the police and arresting people. However, the fact is that the workers have stopped production, and that has produced some pressure on the state government, which I think has led to the negotiations that are taking place today. I don't really have any predictions as to what's going to come out of those negotiations and how much pressure the state is under. Most labor disputes, especially big ones like this one in Mexico, tend to get resolved politically. In other words, it's not just between the workers and the employers, but the government has a big hand in it. And so the workers need the state government to move here, which is, I think, why they're demanding the negotiations with state and national authorities. There hasn't been any reaction from the national government of Peña Nieto, which has basically ignored it completely. This despite the fact that the rights of these workers under existing labor law in Mexico have been violated. And Mexican labor law has been substantially weakened as a result of the labor law reform that was pushed through by President Peña Nieto as soon as he came into office, which made it much easier for employers to do things like hire temporary contract workers at much lower wages. So I think that the Mexican government has a conflict of interest here because it uses the low wages of the workers and it uses things like the weakened rights under the labor law reform as a sort of an incentive, as a magnet to attract investment. So to expect the Mexican government to, on the one hand, even enforce its own labor law and defend these workers, and at the same time use their miserable situation as a way of sort of attracting Driscoll and other investors from the United States, the conflict of interest, I think, is pretty clear there.
It's pretty impressive that the workers have stopped production and are essentially threatening to let the produce rot in the fields and the picked produce rot in containers before they're shipped in the U.S. And here in the U.S., the most we might hear of this outside of the LA Times might be seeing some shortages of produce in our supermarkets. What sort of, as far as I can tell, there hasn't been any official call for any kind of boycott or anything from the United States, but is there a role that U.S. Americans can play here, you think, David?
Yes, I think there is. I think that as consumers, first of all, we need to make our voices heard in the marketplace. So that means, making sure that the places where we buy our produce, that we tell them that we expect them to be responsible in terms of, taking a look at what's happening to the workers who are producing the food that we eat. But I think also that it's important for us to look for ways to provide direct support to the workers themselves who are in struggle and they need it. And then also to look at workers here in the United States. Again, the workers in Baja California are in a sense part of a larger indigenous farm worker community that also exists in California. And I have to say, Sonali, that the conditions of U.S. farm workers are better than they are in Mexico, but they're not a lot better.
Right.
It's very common to see people living in cars and sleeping under trees, especially during harvest time here in California. And we have to sort of stop, how do you want to put it, treating these workers as though they are invisible, as though their lives really don't count at the same time as we eat what they produce.
Well, David Bacon, I want to thank you very much for joining us today and for helping shed light on this issue. And we'll certainly monitor the media to see if more English language news coverage appears. Thanks so much.
It's always a pleasure, Sonali.
David Bacon is an award-winning photojournalist, author, labor journalist, and former labor organizer himself. He's written many books, including The Children of NAFTA, Labor Wars on the U.S.-Mexico Border, and The Right to Stay Home, How U.S. Policy Drives Mexican Migration. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. A hearing-impaired man of Ethiopian descent is suing a Virginia sheriff over a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act in a case of police mistreatment that has garnered international attention. Mr. Abraham Zemera Gegehu was jailed by the Arlington County Sheriff's Department for 6 weeks after being arrested on suspicion of stealing an iPad. He is a U.S. citizen, but having been raised in Ethiopia, he uses Ethiopian Sign Language and American Sign Language, but does not have experience writing in English. Homeless at the time of his arrest, Mr. Zemera Gegehu had a bewildering and frightening experience, with no understanding of why he was being arrested and held for so long. The iPad in question was soon retrieved by its owner, and yet the hearing-impaired man remained in custody. Mr. Zemera Gegehu took a plea deal for a misdemeanor charge to obtain his release, even though he did not steal anything. My guest is Caroline Jackson. She's an attorney with the National Association of the Deaf who's representing Abraham Zemera Gegehu. Welcome to Uprising, Caroline.
Thank you so much.
Well, when it was determined that your client was hearing impaired, what sort of attempts did the Arlington County Sheriff make to communicate with him and let him know why he was being arrested and what his rights were?
They tried to write to him and explain that information to him. However, he doesn't read, and he tried to explain to him that he can't read and that he needed an interpreter. They never provided an interpreter, and because there wasn't one, he really doesn't know what else happened. He didn't understand anything that was going on.
Well, when they determined that he couldn't write or understand written English, shouldn't they have tried to find an ASL interpreter, an American Sign Language interpreter? I understand instead they used a TTY machine, which is simply a device that lets people who are hearing impaired or hard of hearing to communicate with each other in written text. But again, this requires you know written English.
Right. So they should have provided an American Sign Language interpreter, and he actually asked for one, making his request and his need for that even clearer. For the TTY device, actually, that is something that's used as a substitute for a telephone. So they didn't try to use that to communicate with him, but they did try and offer it to him to use to place outbound telephone calls. But you're exactly right about the English piece. He needed to know English in order to use that to place and receive telephone calls, and he simply couldn't. And what's more, the overwhelming majority of deaf and hard of hearing individuals now don't use TTYs anymore. They use a video phone, which works much like Skype does now. If we were signing, we could see each other and we could communicate very clearly. And that's something that most deaf and hard of hearing people do use. But it's not something that the jail offered, and it was something that Mr. Zemera Gegehu needed.
At what point did he understand what was happening to him? I mean, he was incarcerated for 6 weeks. That's a long time. It's like I'm imagining being trapped in a country where I don't speak the language and nobody speaks the language that I do, and being incarcerated and being utterly confused and isolated and frightened and not knowing what was going to happen.
Yeah, he'd never been in trouble with the law before. He knew nothing about the processes that go on inside a jail. He spent 2 nights in jail before he had a court appearance with an interpreter. And it was at that court appearance, at his arraignment, that through the interpreter, he was informed of the charges against him. But he still didn't know about the procedures in jail. He still didn't know about all the subsequent court appearances, about all the other procedures that stood between him and his release. He thought it was a big misunderstanding that would be over in a couple days, and it wasn't.
Now, I understand that while he was imprisoned, he was given a tuberculosis test, and this is a test that requires being injected with something into the skin to see the reaction, and then he was also x-rayed. Is this standard procedure? Did he know what was being done?
So I do not personally know of standard procedure for the Arlington Sheriff's Department. However, I would not think it unusual for a confinement situation like that to involve tuberculosis tests at the outset to forestall an outbreak. But he didn't know what was happening. He just knew that they injected him with some mysterious substance.
Again, this can just be so frightening if you have no idea what's being done to you. I mean, as far as he knew, he might have been injected with something dangerous.
Yeah, as far as he knew, and nobody ever tied it together for him.
And I understand that he also went hungry often because he wasn't able to hear the alarm that was being rung for meal times, and authorities often didn't bother to tell him that it was mealtime, so he even starved periodically?
Yes, and in fact, it's even slightly worse than that. The way the facility worked is that when there was a mealtime, or as far as we know how the facility works, is when there's a mealtime, a buzzer or an alarm or something would ring that would let the inmates know that they could press a button that would open their cell door, and then they could go. And if Mr. Zemedigege, who was not looking in the direction of the other cells at the time that the buzzer rang, maybe he was taking a nap, maybe he was just staring at his cell wall bored, if he didn't know that that's what happened, he would miss the mealtime. He would turn around or wake up and see everybody else's cell empty. But what makes it even worse is at that time, he would go push the button on his cell door and he would try and get out, and they wouldn't let him out.
Now, the lawyers for the county sheriffs write that it would not, what they did not violate federal law because there is a rational basis for their discrimination. They said it takes extra resources and creates additional security considerations to bring an ASL interpreter into the facility. But isn't that the whole point of the Americans for Disabilities Act, that people with disabilities have the right not to be discriminated against in spite of the extra resources it takes to prevent the discrimination?
Exactly. The Americans with Disabilities Act is very clear that covered entities like the Sheriff's Department and the others named in the lawsuit have to do what it takes to make sure that deaf and hard of hearing people have effective communication and that other people with disabilities have the accommodations required for equal access. There are provisions if it's too expensive or it's too dangerous. The law allows for that. But actually, the Virginia Department of Corrections, which is another entity that we've named in the lawsuit, just 5 years ago signed a settlement agreement in which they agreed to provide sign language interpreters in a prison setting, which is even more dangerous than a jail.
Now, what is the, how typical is the experience that Mr. Zemedigege had across the country, not just something that might be happening in Virginia county jails, but in the prison system in general in the United States? How big is the deaf community, and are their rights being respected under the ADA?
His story is all too common. His story is the story of being deaf and behind bars. And so for deaf individuals who are in prison, it's Mr. Zemedigege who's experienced all day, every day for the decades that their sentence lasts. It's very serious. There are efforts right now to improve this situation in prisons. For example, I referenced a settlement agreement reached with the Virginia prisons, and there's other ongoing litigation in several other states in this country. The deaf and hard of hearing population in prisons, it's actually nearly impossible to know how many there are, because when organizations such as ourselves ask these prisons, how many deaf and hard of hearing inmates do you have, they simply say they don't keep those records, or they're not aware that they have any, and they have to be found person by person.
Wow.
There's an organization that is doing this work. It's called Helping Educate to Advance the Rights of the Deaf, heard, and they've identified, I think, over 600 deaf and hard of hearing individuals in prison, but they know that that number is very, very low and that it's only scratching the surface.
So, Caroline, in addition to the rights of the deaf community with the inside prison walls, there's also the circumstances under which arrests take place, right? When somebody is being arrested, we have our Miranda rights. We have to be read our rights to us. But I can't imagine, or don't imagine, that most police officers, arresting police officers, are proficient in ASL.
Yes. They are most arresting officers. In fact, I can think of exactly one arresting officer in this country who is fluent in American Sign Language, and it's a very harrowing experience. There is litigation on this point. In fact, there's an ongoing case in New York City right now where a deaf individual called the police about her neighbor who had threatened her and who had fired shots. And when the police officers came onto the scene, they knew the caller was deaf. They did not provide an interpreter, and they chose to arrest the deaf woman who had called the police, as opposed to the man she had accused.
So in this case, they had advance notice that they would be communicating with somebody who was deaf, and they still didn't bother to bring somebody who was an ASL interpreter. Now, in the case of Mr. Uyematsu, how much of a role do you think his race and nationality also played in his arrest and treatment? And I'm wondering if there, is, we know, of course, that there's racism in our criminal justice system, and particularly in law enforcement officials. This is an issue that's front and center in the media today. Mr. Uyematsu, who is a man of African descent, Ethiopian man, he's dark-skinned, dark-haired, and he is deaf. Do you think that his race and nationality added to the biases that might have been at play?
It's possible. However, there's no direct evidence that we've seen that led to us to make that conclusion. The person who accused him of stealing the iPad set forth the basis for his belief to the police. So it wasn't really the police knowing an iPad had been stolen and picking the dark-skinned man. It was the police knowing of a particular person who had been accused. And so in terms of the reason for his arrest, we have at this point no reason to believe that race or ethnicity played a role. And within the jail setting, Mr. Uyematsu, who has not mentioned anything where he believed or that gave us reason to believe that he was being targeted for those reasons. So fortunately, it seemed that at least that element was not a serious concern here.
Now, how is it possible that he remained incarcerated and was charged with a misdemeanor? He took a plea deal just so that he could get get his freedom back, even when the iPad in question was actually recovered. I mean, so what was stolen?
Well, according to the statements we've received from the prosecutor, the fact that an item has been recovered doesn't mean that it wasn't stolen in the first instance. However, the fact that it was recovered while Mr. Uyematsu was being held incommunicado in a jail is pretty strong evidence that whoever stole it, it wasn't him.
Right. I mean, how was he going to arrange for an item that he supposedly stole to be then released? I mean, certainly I don't think we know necessarily what the circumstances of the loss and the retrieval of the iPad was, but was that fact that the iPad was recovered kept from authorities when he took his plea deal?
It's unclear. So the public defender who represented him has no recollection at all of being given this information. However, the prosecutor asserts that he did share that information with the public defender. So we really don't know. And right now our attention is not on the lawyers and how they handled it. It's on the jail facility and how they didn't honor his rights.
So tell us about the lawsuit that Mr. Uyematsu, who is launching against the Arlington sheriff. In addition to violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, is he also asking for these charges to be dropped?
No, unfortunately, because he's pled guilty, we can't ask charges to be dropped. We have to take a different route.
So what is he asking for in terms of is he basically asking for damages for his treatment?
Yes, due to the nature of U.S. constitutional law, he is not in a position where he can ask for a policy change. That's always first and foremost on our mind in these kinds of cases, but because he can't show with sufficient legal certainty that he'll be ever rearrested, and I mean, he's a very law-abiding man, there's no reason to think that he ever will be rearrested. But because he can't show he'll be rearrested, he cannot ask them to change their policy. However, certainly it is our hope that there will be moments of education that come out of this lawsuit that prevent this from happening again.
Well, Caroline, how important is it to highlight such cases? Because it's not, of course, just the deaf community that is impacted by the lack of training among law enforcement and the county jail systems and prison systems, but of course there is the broader disabled community at large, people with who do have rights under the ADA. I mean, we certainly have the ADA, which can be seen as a major measure of progress, but if it's not being enforced in these very important points of interaction between the state and individuals who are disabled, then what good is it?
I don't know. It's very concerning because to be deaf and interacting with the police is a terrifying experience, because we know how the police treat people who can communicate
Exactly.
with them. Imagine how they treat people who can't. And we hear horror stories of how awful jails and prisons are. It's a special kind of hell if there's no one you can talk to.
Right. And we also know people who suffer from mental disabilities. We already know that that's a huge problem with authorities. And I'm assuming that mental disability is also covered by the ADA?
It is, and just yesterday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in a case brought against the city and county of San Francisco. So it's something, it affects everything. I mean, people in wheelchairs have a lot of lawsuits they have to bring because they're not able to leave their cells, or they're not able to bathe, or they can't leave the facility and go outside because of the presence of steps. And then something that can happen often with blind inmates is they need assistance to find their food, to navigate, et cetera, et cetera. And often prisoners will be assigned to be, instead of getting a guard to assist them, the prison will assign another inmate to assist them, and often make the assignment as punishment to that inmate for having done something wrong. So you can imagine how well that goes.
Wow.
It's a very serious situation that we very much need some intervention on.
Well, Caroline, are there any websites you'd like to share with our audience about this issue? You're with the National Association of the Deaf, and you mentioned another organization, HEARD.
Yeah, so the National Association of the Deaf, our website is www.nad.org. And then the organization HEARD is at www.behearddc.org. That's www.behearddc.org.
And we'll post those on our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, later today. Caroline, thanks so much for joining us.
No problem. Thank you, Sonali.
My guest, Caroline Jackson, is an attorney with the National Association of the Deaf. She is representing Mr. Abraham Zameda Gegyehu. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. An examination of American pop culture reveals that stereotypes of Asian Americans abound. There are few Asians on our screens, and the new sitcom Fresh Off the Boat is one small attempt to undermine the absence. Today, we end our program with a conversation with Japanese-American poet and teacher Amy Uyematsu. Born after World War II, Uyematsu has lived in Los Angeles all her life. She's the co-editor of Roots, an Asian American Reader, which is a widely used anthology in academia. Her earlier poetry publications included 30 Miles from J-Town, Nights of Fire, Nights of Rain, and Stonebow Prayer. Her latest book is entitled The Yellow Door, just out from Red Hen Press. Amy Uyematsu now joins me in studio. Welcome to Uprising.
Thank you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, in reading for this interview and preparing for this interview, I was reading that you embraced the idea of, quote, being a curious, sometimes furious yellow. That made me smile. What does that mean?
Well, actually, when I was younger, I think the phrase was really turned around. I was more a furious, sometimes curious yellow. I grew up in the Sierra Madre, Pasadena area of LA, in a white suburb, and this was in the 50s and 60s, so it's still pretty close to World War II's end. My being called Jap in the classroom was commonplace. There wasn't a single line about my parents and grandparents being interned at Gila and Manzanar. So that was kind of the climate. As far as the curious part of that phrase, I was always curious about knowing more about my own history and the history of Asian Americans, as well as other people of color in this country. And my curiosity extended to wanting to know more about Japan, because I was raised very Americanized. So I'll come back to the furious part. I think the furious part drove me to write a college essay in my senior year called The Emergence of Yellow Power in America. And that got me a job at the UCLA Asian American Studies Center.
Wow.
And the same anger, I think, fueled the poems for my first book, 30 Miles from J-Town.
So how seriously uninformed are Americans still, even today, non-Asian Americans? How uninformed are they about Asians? There's, of course, the persistent model minority myth. For women, there are stereotypes of sexualization and submissiveness. And as someone who's written for academic readers about Asian Americans and been, part of the field of study, are you surprised by how persistent some of the myths continue to be?
I'm not surprised because racism against people of color in this country continues, as we've seen in Ferguson, for example. I think it's a little easier for Asian Americans who live in big cities where we have large populations, but still there are stereotypes. While there has been an improvement in understanding of the concentration camp experience, overall the history of Asian Americans is still largely unknown by the majority population. I'm surprised that people still tend to lump us together with new immigrants. They're surprised if you speak good English. They can't differentiate Japanese versus Chinese versus Korean, etc., and think it doesn't matter. And I also feel that TV and film coverage hasn't really changed much from when I was growing up. There are very few Asian American faces on the screen.
Right. So there's mostly tokenism, but of course I mentioned there's a new sitcom now. We'll see what that leads to. Right. Let's talk about your book of poetry, The Yellow Door. This is your new collection of poems. How deeply do you tackle this issue of identity politics as well as the U.S.'s sort of historical legacy with respect to racism against Asians?
I think all of my books try to include identity politics and Asian American history to some degree. And that's probably because my poetry roots can be traced back to my being a college activist and participating in the anti-war, ethnic studies, and women's movements of the 60s and 70s. So you'll find political themes in all of my books, although it's a core part of my writing, but not the only part of my writing. I've expanded.
Right. I'm wondering if you can read a piece for our audience. There's a piece in your book, The Yellow Door, called No Shade, named Mongoloid.
I'll be happy to read it. And I kept a yellow notebook for several years, and it ultimately led to some of the poems that are in The Yellow Door. And in the yellow notebook, I would keep poems and photos, postcards, and even paint swatches of different shades of yellow. Shades like imperial yellow, Aztec gold, straw hat, rising sun. It was very interesting. But for this poem, there was no shade named Mongoloid. From palest white to sunburned brown, a yellow undertone is enough to incriminate. Suitable for Chinatown hangings, grounds for holding yellow-stamped citizens behind barbed wire fences. When a young girl's skin has that sickly cast, she gets fashion sense early. Never wear amber, chartreuse, or bright canary. Disguise the tint in the cheeks with a pink foundation. She knows the rules for beauty, how yellow glows only with pretty blue eyes. In America, it's undisputed that yellow belongs on traffic signs and school buses, taxi cabs, and rain slickers. But there is no hue called Mongoloid, no smiley face hug for my Japanese mug.
Amy Uyematsu reading from her book, The Yellow Door. And I love how you bring up a political issue, a social issue of identity politics in a very beautifully poetic way that's also quite angry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Back
The Furious Heart.
Curious, Furious, yes.
And you mentioned earlier Asian American culture and ethnicities, of course, hardly homogeneous. They're very heterogeneous. I'm Asian, and I noticed that you touched on that also in some of your poetry. There's another poem that struck me that I really enjoyed called "The Pendant," where you sort of raise the fact that there's people from all different Asian backgrounds in the United States, some of whom are new immigrants, right? And so I'm wondering if you can share this poem, "The Pendant," for us.
Sure. The background of "The Pendant" is that I was at a car dealership with my husband in the San Fernando Valley, and we're in one of those big showrooms where most of the salesmen were white. Except for possibly one salesman. And this poem is about that one salesman and myself. The Pendant. "Where is it from?" he asks. I look down at the green and orange stones engraved with Chinese characters. "Asia, maybe Thailand," I reply, ready to go on my way. But the young man steps closer, like those foreign-born who haven't learned the invisible lines of physical boundary, that distance respecting the female. I'm caught off guard when he lifts the necklace, his fingers almost touching my breast. "It's jade," no hesitation in his voice, and he unbuttons a shirt collar, revealing 3 slender rings on the chain around his neck. "These are jade, too. I'm from the Philippines." I search his face for features like mine. He claims he has some Chinese blood, while I see a freckled complexion and eyes set too deep. Reaching again for my pendant, he's making me nervous, his brief gesture so intimate. Almost greedily, he takes in my Japanese features, and I recognize that hunger for home in this crowded room where no one looks like me. Just before I turn away, he appeals, "I always wear jade."
The Pendant by Amy Uyematsu, reading for us from her book, The Yellow Door. Your poetry is very touching and very evocative, especially for people of color in this country who I think, listening to that, I could certainly relate to it. We don't hear enough about racism against Asian Americans in the United States, but of course it is pervasive. We mentioned earlier the stereotypes, and you brought up the internment camps that you mentioned that your parents were interned in during World War II, the horrible things that Japanese Americans went through. And you have a poem in your book called Haiku for the Unsuspecting Fortune Cookie Reader. It's a jarring poem, but it takes sort of head on the kinds of things that Asian Americans have been subjected to. And I'm wondering if you can read that poem now.
I'd be happy to read it, Sonali. And a little background. The poem is the result of my hearing about a trendy clothing store in the New York Soho area called Yellow Rat Bastard, of all things, and it's still there.
Wow.
This poem consists of 8 short haiku in the traditional 17-syllable style. There's a reference to Abercrombie and Fitch, who back in 2002, I believe, carried a racist line of T-shirts that had faces of Asians in caricature style. And the title I got just thinking about what would it be like if a person went to an Asian restaurant, expects their fortune cookie at the end of the meal, and when they open up the fortune cookie, they find some of these haiku messages. So this is called Haiku for the Unsuspecting Fortune Cookie Reader. It's only a joke. Yellow rat bastard T-shirts with cute matching bags. Feng Shui and sushi are American staples. Yellow skin is not. Fortune Cookie says, Oriental eyes are fun. They can make you laugh. Some myths won't die. We're model minorities. We all speak Ching Chong. Fortune cookie says, beware of Asian students, all smiles and A's. The shape of our eyes has been evidence enough, un-American. Insults bring profits on Abercrombie t-shirts, $25 hip. Asian invasions. The trader's eyes are slanted. History as lie.
Amy Uyematsu, thank you so much for reading the haiku for the unsuspecting fortune cookie reader from your book, The Yellow Door. What do you hope readers take away from your book? And I'm wondering if you can also close with your short poem, Women's Lib Asian American Style, which I think is just a wonderful sort of empowering call.
I'm hoping the reader can learn something about Asian American history and culture, especially younger Asian Americans and younger people of color. And I hope people will think about the meaning of yellow in our culture. What yellow means to an Asian girl is certainly not the same as what it means to a blonde schoolmate. So I will read Women's Lib Asian American Style that has an epigraph by David Bowie's China Girl song. Oh, 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 ho, little China girl. I used to be called Oriental, equal parts Susie Wong, Japanese pearl, China doll, and geisha girl. I admit I'd been raised to nod and smile. But no way in hell was I ever going to grovel as your beaming ornamental. Never again your servile, oh so exotic, erotic yellow jewel.
Amy Uyematsu, thank you so much for joining us today, and best of luck with your